This is America, and this is Old Town Alexandria in the state of Virginia, home to historic shops and historic cobblestone streets. As the Trump administration imposes tariffs on dozens of countries, shopkeepers such as these are feeling the pinch. Higher import costs for them and higher prices for you. Now, the impact isn't being felt just here, but far beyond the U.S.'s borders. I'll have more on all of that in just a second, but first, let's go to Alex Marquardt in our Washington studio.
Thanks, Rosalind. Donald Trump has called himself Tariff Man, and he's insisted that tariffs are making Americans rich. Back in April, the U.S. Supreme Court stood up to Trump and rejected his global tariffs. But now, just a few months later, they are back, rebuilt through a different law and aimed at some 60 countries. Critics say it's the same Trump policy dressed up differently, and economists argue that Americans will get stuck paying more. And the legal fight is not over as Trump continues to make his case.
Tariffs, tariffs. Tariffs. My favorite word, tariffs.
Tariff is my favorite word in the whole dictionary. So what about family? What about God? What about wife, children? I said, all right, it's my fifth favorite word.
Tariffs are about making America rich again and making America great again, and it's happening, and it will happen rather quickly. There'll be a little disturbance, but we're okay with that.
Trump's approach to tariffs has been one of the most controversial economic policies here in the U.S. in recent history. He has broadly treated them as leverage rather than tax policy, angering allies and trade partners alike. In February of last year, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on neighbors Canada and Mexico, and then another 10% on China. Beijing retaliated, and that triggered a tit-for-tat escalation between the two countries. Trump then targeted steel and aluminum imports with a 25% tariff. Next was the automotive industry and a 25% tariff on foreign cars. Then came so-called Liberation Day and a minimum 10% baseline tariff on virtually all trading partners. Markets plunged, and it renewed fears of a global trade war. By the end of last year, the policy had become a patchwork of country and sector-specific tariffs, with steel and aluminum doubling to 50%. Then came the big legal challenge. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Trump had overstepped by invoking emergency powers to bring in the tariffs and forcing the administration to find new ways. So, will the third time be the charm for Trump's tariffs? The president is convinced the tariffs will both replenish the Treasury and hold other countries accountable for what he has repeatedly said is unfriendly and unfair treatment of American workers and consumers. Aljazeera's Rosalind Jordan takes stock of where things stand.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day.
U.S. President Donald Trump's shock and awe approach to tariffs unraveled the global economy in 2025. 18 months later, with the Iran war unresolved and the midterm elections approaching, the White House wants tariffs without the frayed headlines.
Our businesses were stolen by foreign countries. They're all coming back.
The latest tactic, using obscure laws imposing 10 to 12.5% tariffs on the U.S.'s 60 biggest trading partners because they haven't cracked down on forced labor. More could follow once an investigation into manufacturing capacity from the EU to China and India is done. Aware that tariffs have rattled the economy and his popularity, Trump insists things will improve once his vision is in place. Some business owners, though, are skeptical.
We're stable right now. This next round of tariffs that is being laid upon the world may have an effect on that. I haven't seen it yet.
And they say shipping costs are a much bigger problem because it does affect what customers pay.
This is a very real, very boots on the ground experience of hardship, of stress, of pain. You know, we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like on any given day right now.
For example, this very popular British yarn used to sell for years for about $15 a ball. Now, thanks to tariffs, the price has gone up to $17. It's the same with linen pillows. They used to be a luxury, but now they have to be on sale before customers are opening their wallets. Meantime, Trump has dug in on his trade dispute with Canada, threatening $20 billion worth of cars, alcohol, and cheese. Nothing will likely shut down the flow of commerce across the new Gordon Howe Bridge until after the November midterms.
Bonjour tout le monde.
And the Canadian economist turned prime minister knows it.
We have foreign direct investment twice the rate of our nearest G7 competitor, which is the United States.
Twice, U.S. courts have ruled Trump's tariffs illegal, forcing refunds of $100 billion and counting. Now, 25 states have sued the administration for what they call yet another attempt to make life more expensive for consumers and small businesses. All this has countries wondering if these latest White House tariffs will be the last, and small businesses hoping the tariffs don't cause their plans to spin out of control. Rosalind Jordan, Aljazeera, Alexandria, Virginia.
Tariffs are also hitting American wallets quite hard, impacting household spending at a critical political time with the midterm elections just around the corner. Al Jazeera's Tanya Nouri takes a closer look.
President Donald Trump said raising tariffs will revitalize American manufacturing, but consumers are wondering why they are the ones footing the bill.
And do you think the company pays the tariffs? No, they pass it along to the consumer. You're all paying higher prices every time you get something through retail.
The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation estimates that tariffs added around $1,000 to the average U.S. household's cost in 2025. Shoppers contend they are feeling the difference.
I think almost every item is more expensive. And I just came back from Europe, and to compare it with Europe, which is also not cheap, it's ridiculous what it costs here.
I spend more money per week than I used to, and I estimate it at about 30%.
The White House argues that higher costs now will pay off in the future. In a statement to Al Jazeera, White House spokesman Kush Desai said American workers, farmers, and businesses are ultimately set to see new jobs, real wage growth, and billions in new export opportunities thanks to President Trump's tariffs. But a study by the Yale Budget Lab found that tariffs had little effect either way on jobs, with previous trends in manufacturing job losses continuing.
It's going to have a huge effect on the midterms, and there's no way of stopping it anymore. I don't think Donald Trump has tanked the economy. He's tanked the world's economy.
And ahead of midterms, a new poll puts Democrats slightly ahead of Republicans on the economy, marking their first lead on the issue in nearly a decade.
It will take a long time to recover from the tariffs. And I don't think it will happen before the midterms.
For now, voters are feeling the higher prices when they're at the register. By November, they will have to decide whether it matters when they're at the ballot box. Tanya Nouri, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's get into all of this with our experts. We have Diego Marroquin Bitar. He is an advisor at CSIS, as well as Harry Broadman, the former U.S. Assistant Trade Representative and Chief of Staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Diego, Harry, thank you both for being with me. Harry, President Trump is using something called Section 301, essentially as a workaround. The Supreme Court famously struck down Trump's tariffs. That was back in April. How effective, or perhaps how harmful, in your opinion, do you think this new workaround is going to be?
Well, I think the first go-around of using IEPA, this emergency act, I think was probably not the smartest decision by USTR to recommend that.
And IEPA is what the Supreme Court ruled against them being able to use.
Correct. And so now we're back to where most of us trade negotiators like to be, using specific statutes that deal with unfairness, discrimination, national security issues. That's the meat and potatoes of trade law. IEPA was a very strange animal, frankly, to be used.
And so do you think that this is going to hold up? How significant do you think the legal challenges are going to be?
I think they're going to be significant, but I think he has shifted his tone, I think, and the words that he's using. How can we use tariffs to make U.S. industry sharper, more competitive, rather than, I think, in the IEPA days, not long ago, people are being unfair to us. and I'm going to use a broad, sweeping law that says that we have an economic emergency, which for trade people like me, I thought it was really a very poor choice.
Because you don't see any kind of economic emergency.
No, I mean, you've got to bolster that case pretty substantially with numbers and other kinds of analytical work, and that was not to be found. At least I wasn't able to locate it.
I mean, one of the very specific lines when you look at this provision in the law, again, Section 301, is that these countries that are going to be have tariffs imposed on them allegedly haven't done enough to block imports made with forced labor. Diego, is that true or is that a pretext?
No, that is true. I want to complement what we just discussed. We've heard a lot about Greek mythology. We all went to see the Odyssey. We have to think of the IEEPA tariffs as Theos thunder, something that could be used immediately, applied very broadly, and you didn't need to consult anyone, Congress or the American people. What this new phase of the trade wars, this new tariff architecture that President Trump is building is more procedural, but it can be more dangerous. It's using these new tools. Well, some of them are being used for the first time ever, like Section 338, but Section 301, to your point, has specific requirements. You have to consult. In the case of 301, I think it's the Department of Commerce. There needs to be a consultation process, but then once you comply with all those requirements, you can put tariffs on countries on a stronger legal ground. So this new phase is less fast, it is less broad, but it's more dangerous in the sense that it has a stronger legal ground, like the forced labor tariffs.
So does the Trump administration have to go country by country, and the number that I keep seeing is 60, and prove that they have used forced labor on these imports?
The argument that they're using is that those countries haven't implemented legislation to stop forced labor, or in the case that they haven't done a good enough job to stop forced labor being basically forced labor in their own supply chains and in their trade with the U.S.
Harry?
No, I think you're absolutely correct. There has to be a case made on a country-by-country basis, which is where the problem was with this previous go-to with IEEPA, was just a sweeping. So yes, they're going to have to make the case country by country. And I presume, again, that USTR is doing its job, Commerce is doing their job, Treasury, and they figured out before they lobbied the president to change his tune in terms of what laws, that they presented some evidence. Maybe I'm wrong, but that is going to be the test, and that's what the Hill and businesses and others who might lose still from tariffs will argue.
Someone who's as steeped in this as you are, were you surprised to see the administration take this tack, or was this something that would have been expected after the Supreme Court ruling a couple months ago?
Well, the Supreme Court ruling was out, way out of the ballpark from what, but I think the administration paid for that dearly. No, this is the way it's done, and there's homework that has been done. There's more homework that will be done. There'll be hearings in the Congress. There'll be people testifying. They'll bring in, other experts to say, yeah, that's discriminatory, that's unfair, and so forth.
So the argument that we hear repeatedly from those who are opposed to tariffs when it comes to the domestic consequences, of course, are the higher costs that are going to be passed on to the consumer. Let's take a look at what the data says about the effect of these tariffs. According to research that was done by Yale Budget Lab, here's where prices were headed before the tariffs. This is where they estimate prices would have gone with no tariffs. And here is where the index shows prices are going with tariffs. So looking at December 2024 as a baseline for all this data, the index that was compiled by the lab shows that prices for everyday items and long-lasting goods went up around 1.5% over the course of last year. Now, higher than they would have if no tariffs had been put in place. Leaving out the volatile fuel imports, this is where import prices headed as tariffs were put in place. The study found that foreign companies trying to sell goods to Americans responded to tariffs by increasing their prices, not lowering their prices. So for 2026, for this year, in short, the Yale researchers estimate that tariffs could cost an average household between $760 to $940. So Diego, domestically, when it comes to the regular consumer, where do you think this will be felt most acutely?
Well, first of all, at the checkout, as you said, tariffs are taxes on consumers. So, for example, you have a trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. You import lots of fruits and vegetables from Mexico. If you put tariffs on those goods, you'll ultimately make those tomatoes, those berries, those avocados more expensive. In the case of Canada, construction materials, lumber, aluminum, and all the other trade partners that the U.S. has, by putting tariffs on them, you make ultimately consumption more expensive, construction more expensive.
Harry?
It's up to the companies to decide how much they want to pass on, right?
Right.
Some companies can absorb those costs.
They can take smaller margins.
Take smaller margins. They can leave the market for the sake of argument because it's not competitive. So it's not a foregone conclusion that all prices will rise. You can be sure that they will pass on because their costs have gone up. And that's what's going to be felt most immediately by the public. And I think that's what the White House has to be prepared for, their talking points when this happens.
But one of the talking points, and this is from the U.S. Trade Representative today, they tweeted that this new policy of tariffs is going to, quote, put more money back into American workers' pockets.
It's just a question of when.
Explain.
Well, if it works through the system and our industries become more competitive as being protected, higher incomes because new jobs and so forth, more production. That's a chain of reasoning that is almost always empirically fraught to figure out the causality. But yes, some is going to be passed on to consumers. It's going to vary by firm. It's going to vary by sector. It's how competitive the industry is. So if an industry does not have a set of firms, doesn't have a lot of competitors, this will raise the prices, right? So it's not across the board foregone conclusion that prices will go up. It will vary.
Diego, what's going to be the impact on the job market?
Well, and again, it depends. I think the real issue with tariffs is the uncertainty that they generate in the U.S.'s investment environment and with other countries. If you don't know what the rules of the game are going to be, the rules of market access, it's harder for companies in the U.S. to source materials from other countries or to export to other countries as well. So the real cost is the uncertainty in the job market. So if you don't know what the rules of the game are going to be for a U.S. company, you might not hire people for next year. You might be in the position that you have to lay off some people actually, or you have to reduce the amount of things that you import from other countries or the amount of things that you put out in shelves. So it depends by industry.
I think the White House would argue, whether it's true or not, we'll see, that this will create jobs because our industries are becoming more competitive, artificially to be sure, and therefore we're going to be able to run our factories longer because we are going to be protected from competition that we might otherwise face. But the market generally works, and so the question is, it's going to vary by industry whether there's higher or lower employment and so forth. But it's an argument that I think Trump will hear.
There are certainly some who are going to be benefiting from these tariffs, and it is said that a rising tide lifts all boats in an economy, but that hasn't necessarily been the case. There have been some direct winners from tariffs with local metal manufacturers and some domestic agricultural sectors, but even these industries are paying higher costs for materials and spare parts due to new taxes. The biggest winners from Trump's tariffs have been some of the world's largest companies, which are now they are owed billions in tariff rebates after selling goods for higher prices. But thousands of smaller businesses have had to close as imported goods have become too expensive. An estimate from an advocacy group called the We Pay the Tariffs says that the duties have cost consumers and small businesses some $317 billion since March of last year. Other losers from Trump's tariffs include foreign exporters who sell to the U.S. The biggest winners have been America's largest companies, including Apple, for example, which stand to get billions of dollars back from the government in tariff refunds after the Supreme Court decision that limited their scope. So, Diego, we often see the president surrounding himself with people like Tim Cook of Apple, top CEOs, Sam Altman, Elon Musk. What do you think these major American CEOs are telling the president right now?
That tariffs are sticky. Well, that supply chains are sticky. If you put a tariff from one day to the other, it takes some time for those supply chains to rearrange themselves, and that ultimately carries costs for those companies. So I think the message that they're trying to put forward to the White House is that you need to move this a little bit slower, and that you have to be a lot more careful. And this is an entirely different conversation from what you just said, the study about We Pay the Tariffs with small and medium enterprises. They have a lot less flexibility to adapt to those changes, and they have to take more debt, for example, which is a completely different situation what the larger companies, tech companies, are doing at the moment.
When you listen to the president, Harry, and he talks often about other countries taking advantage of us, is this, in your opinion, rectifying things, or is it trying to impose new leverage on both allies and adversaries?
I think it's both of those things. I mean, the problem is that he has not made a cogent argument, right, from a strategic perspective. I think what he is hoping for is that the greater protection will help our industries invest more in our factories and our plants and laboratories, and therefore we become more competitive. That chain of reasoning sounds great, but sometimes, maybe often, it does not hold true when you look at the data over time. And it does take time.
And if I can say something there, I think the instinct is right. We need to protect our domestic industry. China presents an industrial threat to U.S. job and U.S. industrial capacity, but you don't have to reach and use tariffs. I think tariffs are not the right tool. You need to work with your allies in order to reshore more production, in order to make sure that you have enough inputs, enough critical minerals to be competitive, to innovate, and perhaps tariffs are not the way to do that in the most effective, cost-effective way.
Let's talk about those allies and adversaries. Harry, last time we spoke, it was about the USMCA. That's being renegotiated. That's very much up in the air. There's been some very aggressive language just in the past few days from the president towards Canada, calling them nasty. How are Mexico and Canada, two of our closest trading partners, dealing with this uncertainty?
I think they will fight back, but they're in a real pickle because they're in the middle of this USMCA, which is obviously also forwarded for negotiation. So they will have to step very carefully. I think one issue which I don't think many people appreciate is the deficit with China they'll probably be the third largest deficit with the U.S., whereas Vietnam and Mexico now are going to have the largest deficits with the United States. So the president is trying to trade down China's sort of front on the market relative to other countries, Vietnam and Mexico. And that speaks volumes for how competitive the Vietnam and the Mexican firms can be.
I think the difference between Vietnam and Mexico, yes, the United States put tariffs on China. They cut the deficit by half from 2018 to 2025. That deficit moved. It relocated to Vietnam, to Malaysia, some to Mexico as well. The difference is that the U.S. builds things together with Mexico. Mexican exports have U.S. value, U.S. labor in them, contrary to Vietnam's. And moving forward, in order to this negotiation to be successful, I think Mexico needs to show the U.S. how their inputs, their labor makes the U.S. more competitive. And I don't think that's an argument that Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand can make.
I just want to quickly play some of the reaction from world leaders to these latest Trump tariffs. Take a listen.
The decision announced last night was both brutal and unfounded.
Nobody wins in a trade war. That is not in our national interest.
They go against the basis of our two nations partnership. This is not the act of a friend.
But it has very serious effects for the economy of the United States, as it's going to greatly increase the cost of products imported from Mexico.
So, Harry, is there any preferential treatment given to closer friends and allies, or is it pretty even-handed across the board?
I think it remains to be seen, but I think there probably will be pressure to put preferential treatment on allies. Whether Mr. Trump, will accede to that pressure, I think is a whole other matter. He will say, well, if you're really a good friend, why don't you help us become more competitive? Which is a circular argument. But I think it's going. This is the beginning of a negotiation, and it's not just with one country or two countries. It's a number of countries. And meanwhile, of course, you mentioned the IEEPA refunds. That's also up in the air now because it's not clear when they're going to transpire, who's going to get them, and the like. So the U.S. Trade Representative and Mr. Trump have a lot on their agenda to get through before we can figure out whether or not this is more of a winning strategy than this previous one with IEEPA.
How do other countries approach these negotiations, Diego, when we have seen so much whiplash, these huge numbers, percentage for tariffs that were imposed and then removed? It just seems like a very uncertain, to say the least, person to negotiate against, country to negotiate against.
Yeah, no, uncertainty is the only constant that we have. And I think most countries by now, they've dealt with this for over a year. I think they're aware that this new tariff architecture and the previous one was made in order to bring those countries into the negotiation table, to make those countries concede and give some things to the US that they haven't done before, or fulfill their commitments that they didn't do before. And in the particular case of Mexico and Canada, I think President Sheinbaum and Prime Minister Carney understand really well that there might be some threats in the public narrative, there might be some tariffs announced, but I think the U.S. has a real stake in extending the agreement. This is USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, is essential to fight back inflation in the U.S. Mexico and Canada are the United States' top 2 trading partners. The United States needs Mexican inputs, Canadian energy, and that's how I think they are playing this negotiation.
All right. Well, there's a lot left to be determined, that is for sure, with huge consequences. Diego Marroquin-Bitar and Harry Broadman, thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank
you. That's all from me and the team here in Washington. I want to hand it back to Rosalind Jordan and Aljazeera's global headquarters in Doha.
Thanks, Alex. On the next edition of This is America, what's happening in Venezuela? We take a deep dive into the Trump administration's strategy on that South American country and ask whether it's working. That's Thursday, 1830 GMT or 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time here in the U.S. From all the team here in Washington and across America, thanks for watching. See you soon.